I come to the floor this afternoon to speak to some of the actions that President Trump has taken just in his first 3 to 4 days, and speak to the nomination of Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense. President Trump was sworn in at noon on Tuesday, just down the hall a bit. As a candidate, he ran promising to help working men and women throughout the country. He talked about addressing their kitchen table issues. So let's take a quick look at some of the big actions that have been taken just in the last 4 days. One very serious action taken was pardoning the men and women who were convicted of bludgeoning and assaulting police officers in this Capitol on January 6, 2001. For those of us who were here that day, we will never forget, because after losing that election, Donald Trump unleashed rioters on Capitol Hill, rampaging throughout the citadel of democracy, clubbing police officers with baseball bats, and crushing them between doors. 140 law enforcement officers from the Capitol Police and the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police were injured that day. I remember their heroism, and I remember those who died in the days following those attacks. Mr. President, to pardon people who were convicted of assaulting and bloodying and bludgeoning police officers demonstrates contempt for the men and women who help protect us every day, not just here in the Capitol, but men and women in law enforcement throughout the country. As the Fraternal Order of Police and the International Association of Police Chiefs have said, and I quote, "Allowing those convicted of these crimes to be released early diminishes accountability and devalues the sacrifices made by courageous law enforcement officers and their families." They go on to say that this leniency, quote, "sends a dangerous message that the consequences of attacking law enforcement are not severe, potentially emboldening others to commit similar acts of violence," unquote. Simple result of this is to send a terrible message that if you assault police officers in the name of Donald Trump, he will be there to pardon you. Let's look at some of the other actions he's taken just in these first days back in the White House. He issued an executive order that rolls back initiatives to help reduce the costs of prescription drugs for more Americans. He's been laying the groundwork here on Capitol Hill for a huge new tax cut that will disproportionately benefit the super wealthy and the biggest corporations at the expense of other Americans. We heard him speak at that podium during his swearing in of the golden age. And sitting right behind him were the billionaire titans from the tech industry. He is going to deliver a golden age, an even more golden age, for those who are already very wealthy and for the biggest corporations, but it's not going to trickle down and help others. And we know that because we've seen this movie before. We saw Trump tax cuts 1.0. They promised that investments in businesses would go up. The idea being if you provide tax cuts to big corporations, they'll take the additional savings and they'll invest it in their businesses. Well, that's been looked at, and that didn't happen. What did go up were stock buybacks engaged in by the corporations to further benefit their shareholders, many of them already very wealthy people. They promised that those savings would be used by corporations to increase wages. In fact, they said on average it would be $4,000 a worker. Just didn't happen. What went up? were CEO bonuses. What else went up was the deficit and the debt. The claim that these would somehow pay for themselves was just, once again, a pure falsehood disproved by reality. So here we are embarking on 2.0, Trump tax cuts 2.0. Same story unfolding, although now we already hear our colleagues talking about how everybody else in America and many other millions of Americans are going to have to pay for the tax cuts for the folks at the very top. Just take a look at some of the proposals made by the chairman of the House Budget Committee, Republican member of Congress, talking about trillions of cuts in things like Medicaid, a very important health program that helps kids with disabilities, helps lower-income individuals, helps seniors in nursing homes, talking about cutting programs in food and nutrition programs. So everyone seems to be all in with President Trump on the idea of another round of tax cuts for the very rich, but they're going to ask everybody else in the country to pay for it. Let's look at something else the president did in this first 3 or 4 days. He issued an executive order called Schedule F. Well, what is Schedule F? In a nutshell, Schedule F is an attempt to convert our merit-based civil service into a political cronyism-based civil service. Since the late 1800s and the Pendleton Act, we've had a civil service based on merit. Civil servants, people who work for the federal government in regular ongoing positions, they have to pass the test, show they're qualified, that they're experienced, that they've got the know-how. It's what you know, not who you know. And what President Trump and his team are proposing in Schedule F is to convert that merit-based system into a politics-based system where you have a political litmus test, not for competence, but for your politics. I should point out that, of course, presidents are entitled to lots of people in their administration as political appointments. In fact, there are about 4,000 political appointments in our current system. Obviously, you have the secretaries of various departments. I'm going to talk about one of those in a minute. But you have the deputy secretaries, you have many assistant secretaries. So you have 4,000 political appointments already available to be made by President Trump. But that's not enough, apparently. They're talking about converting approximately a number, about 16,000 additional positions that are currently merit-based systems, based on your qualifications, to political cronyism-based systems. That is a recipe for corruption. It's a recipe for reducing the quality of services to the American people from coast to coast. You do not want somebody who's chosen just because of who they know and who their politics are to be the people doing your food inspection or working on policy on all sorts of important things that impact the American people. And a lot of those positions will be at the Department of Defense. So I want to turn now to the nomination of Pete Hegseth to be the Secretary of Defense. Now, I mentioned that presidents have the flexibility to appoint many political folks to positions in the U.S. government. But for the top ones, for the Secretary of Defense, for example, the founders of this country, those who wrote the Constitution, put a little bit of check and balance in that. They said the Senate has the right to advise and consent on those very top positions because of those are incredibly consequential decisions, and we want people of good judgment and good character in those positions. And so that's what the Senate is engaged in right now, is a debate under the Advise and Consent Clause of the United States Constitution. And I think we all recognize that we're here at a very perilous moment in the world. We have Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine. Our allies are watching closely to know whether we're going to stand with the people of Ukraine. Other people are watching too. President Xi of China, he has one eye on what's happening in Ukraine as he has another eye on Taiwan. And we have huge challenges in the Indo-Pacific region. We have a very combustible Middle East with the malign actions that Iran continues to take. We have a very fragile ceasefire in Gaza with the return of hostages. If you look around the world, it is in a very, very sensitive and explosive moment. And we should keep that in mind as we decide whether we're going to provide advice and consent to Pete Hegseth for Secretary of Defense. Somebody who will be overseeing 3.4 million service members and employees. Someone who will be second to the president in making decisions on the operation of our nuclear forces. Someone who will oversee what represents over half of the entire discretionary budget of the United States of America, $850 billion. So in this moment, it's especially important that we look at his qualifications, because what we don't want is somebody who's untested and incompetent and someone of low character running the Defense Department in the highest position of that department. And yet, as we've heard from ample testimony, that's exactly what will happen if Pete Hegseth is confirmed to be Secretary of Defense. As our colleague, Senator Reid of Rhode Island, the ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, someone who served in the 82nd Airborne, has said, service members with Mr. Hegseth's record would be disqualified, not just from the highest position of the Defense Department, but any position in the military. And yet, this Secretary of Defense would be overseeing all of those men and women who we ask to uphold the highest tradition and values of our country. And yet the person who would be in charge, if confirmed, would be somebody who would be disqualified from being one of them. That is a terrible message to send. Let's take a look at the record on management as well as the personal conduct of the person that President Trump has nominated to be head of the Defense Department, Mr. Hegseth. He led 2 veterans organizations and, based on the testimony, in both cases engaged in financial mismanagement and wasteful spending. When managing a budget of under $10 million, he repeatedly overspent until the organization was on the edge of bankruptcy. In his next leadership role, he continued to overspend, including on social events and excessive drinking. His successor in that position was told, and I quote, "Among the staff, the disgust for Pete was pretty high. Most veterans do not think he represents them, nor their highest standard of excellence," unquote. He was told that funds that had been used to fund Mr. Hegseth's partying and drinking, as well as his use of work events to, quote, "hook up with women on the road," unquote. Mr. Hegseth has a disturbing history of sexual harassment. In 2017, he was credibly accused of raping a woman in a California hotel room. We learned yesterday that Mr. Hegseth paid the woman $50,000 to prevent her from talking about the assault. We also know that he failed to disclose that information to the transition team, attempting to keep it secret. We can understand why he didn't want the American people and the Senate to know that. So, Mr. President, I really wonder how the Senate could possibly confirm Mr. Hegseth for an entry-level security clearance let alone the enormous responsibility of leading the Department of Defense and the men and women who serve there. Let's take a look at another aspect of Mr. Hegseth's record, because whoever is Secretary of Defense has to understand that they represent the great American military, every single person in it, regardless of background, regardless of religion, regardless of race, regardless of sexual orientation. That is their job. They all bleed red. They're all out there fighting for the United States of America. They've all sworn to defend our country. And yet, if you look at his statements, it's very clear that he believes military service is for some, but not all Americans who want to serve. His remarks are centered on disparaging women, people in the LGBT community, and Muslim Americans. Let's look at the women serving in the military. He has said, and I quote, "I'm straight up just saying we should not have women in combat roles," unquote. Now, I watched some of the hearing. I saw him try to wiggle out of statements that he had made very clearly, like this one I just read. And frankly, nobody should be fooled by this 11th hour conversion as he seeks to be confirmed by the United States Senate. He said what he said, and it was actually part of a pattern when it came to women serving in the military. In his 2024 book called The War on Warriors, Mr. Hegseth criticized both the Don't Ask, Don't Tell, as well as its repeal, writing that these policies are just part of a social justice agenda. I would say to those men and women who are serving in our military, who have been condemned and criticized by Mr. Hegseth, we all thank you for your service. Most of us thank you for your service. In his 2020 book, American Crusade, Mr. Hegseth portrays contemporary cultural and political conflicts in the United States. He portrays them as part of the Crusades, and frames, quote, Islamism and Muslim immigration as existential threats to American society. Again, we have a military comprised of people of all different faiths. They've all sworn an oath to defend this country. And we should not have a Secretary of Defense that maligns a big group based on their faith and engages in that kind of bigotry. And yet, in 2015, a former employee reported that Hegseth chanted, quote, "Kill all Muslims," unquote, and then said, in a drunk and violent manner. He said that. So, Mr. President, these are just some examples of the words and conduct of the person that we are considering to be Secretary of Defense for all the men and women who serve in our armed forces and in the Pentagon. And we should not want any member of our military to be fearful of the person who's leading them. And yet, if you're fall into one of these groups, or even if you're not, you should be very scared about what he has said, maligning certain Americans and trying to pit people against each other based on faith, based on gender, based on sexual orientation. Mr. President, I want to turn to one other category of important issues that we would think, I hope we would think, should be upheld by a Secretary of Defense. Mr. Hegseth has lacked moral clarity and expertise about lots of elements of the military and war, including the laws of armed conflict. And his comments suggest that he does not believe that the United States Armed Forces should follow the laws of war. One of the very important principles we instill in our professional U.S. military is the importance of following the laws of war. And yet Mr. Hegseth has lobbied for pardons of military members who were turned in based on testimony of their peers for illegal behavior and convicted by military courts. He defended military contractors convicted of war crimes, including killing 14 unarmed Iraqi citizens without cause, just for fun, just because they thought they could get away with it. He has repeatedly mocked the laws of armed conflict and expressed unequivocal support for service members who have been convicted of war crimes. In his book, so-called The War on Warriors, he writes, and I quote, "Should we follow the Geneva Conventions? Aren't we just better off in winning our wars according to our own rules?" Mr. President, former colleague of ours, and a great American hero, Senator McCain, would be turning in his grave to hear these kind of comments. I want to read what Senator McCain said about the importance of the laws of war. Quote, "War is wretched beyond description, and only a fool or a fraud could sentimentalize its cruel reality. The Geneva Conventions and the Red Cross were created in response to the stark recognition of the true horrors of unbounded war, and I thank God for that. I am thankful for those whose dignity, health, and lives have been protected by the conventions." Senator John McCain in 1999. Hegseth, 2025. Let's just get rid of those rules of war, put in place because of the hard-earned lessons of, as Senator McCain said, the wretchedness of war. Mr. Hegseth has also talked about going back to days of illegal waterboarding and ignoring the Geneva Convention and other rules when it comes to torture and interrogation, saying that we should, again, as he said, just sort of ignore those rules, do our own thing. Here's what Senator McCain said about that when it was debated here in the United States Senate. "I know from personal experience," Senator McCain said, "that the abuse of prisoners will produce more bad than good intelligence. I know that victims of torture will offer intentionally misleading information if they think their captors will believe it. I know they will say whatever they think their torturers want them to say if they believe it will stop their suffering. Most of all, I know the use of torture compromises that which most distinguishes us from our enemies, our belief that all people, even captured enemies, possess basic human rights, which are protected by international conventions the United States not only joined, but for the most part authored," unquote, Senator McCain. Now, I know that President Trump disdains that great American hero, Senator McCain. In fact, here's what candidate Trump said back in 2015, quote, "He's not a war hero. He was a war hero because he was captured. I like people who weren't captured," unquote, says somebody who never served in the military. Colleagues, I urge us to apply the standards that Senator McCain would apply. I urge us to listen to our colleague Jack Reed, who served in the 82nd Airborne and has with great diligence, serves as the ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. I would ask our colleagues, based on this record of personal misconduct, financial mismanagement, Pete Hegseth's disregard for many men and women who serve in the military based on his own statements, and his contempt for the rules of war that John McCain so eloquently upheld. So when it comes to this senator, I hope other senators, when it comes to providing advice and consent as part of our constitutional duty under the Constitution and balance of powers, I will withhold my consent, and I urge my colleagues to vote no on the nomination of Pete Hegseth to serve as the Secretary of Defense. And I yield the floor.